Hey there, Year 12. It's now time to have a look at another part of Nietzsche's text. I know that I said that I would explore the rest of part 5 in one video, but I thought it's better to break it down into shorter videos. So I'm going to explore section 201, which is part of part 5 now, and then I'll explore section, what's the next section, 203 in another section, just so that we can chunk the content a bit more, okay? So our overall goal today is to explore how Nietzsche argues that herd morality is born out of fear, and then to explore the negative consequences of this morality, because that's what this section is trying to pretty much highlight. Now, what does this mean we have to do in terms of our smaller goals? Well, we need to name, define, and interrelate our key terms. We need to then explore different drives and behaviors valued by different types of societies or cultures or different periods of history. And then we need to explore why Nietzsche thought that herd morality celebrates and openly values drives slash behaviors slash values that enable the herd to protect itself. And these drives slash values, etc., weren't necessarily good values to keep. So if you could quickly go 1, 2, 3, score yourself on the success criteria, that would be great. And then I want you to draw a picture of a homeless person and then tell me how you feel. The reason for that is because you might be feeling something called pity or compassion. And Nietzsche has a bit of a historical claim on how pity or passion were viewed at different periods of history. Could you do that for me, please? So here is Nietzsche, right? And he says, what are moral judgments? But basically a set of rules or principles or moral assumptions that are designed to preserve the community. That's what they do. There's my preserve, there's the community. These moral judgments protect the community from threats or from whatever types of fear could be encroaching upon it. So really, morality protects the community because it protects us from threats. And that means that we must be afraid of quite often if we need this kind of morality because it's there to protect us from these fears that we perceive. And we're only talking about herd morality here, okay? So that's why I'm saying the community is the same thing as the herd. So if I go and look at this diagram here, I say commandments are nothing but things that help us. Well, morality is nothing but a way of preserving the interests of the community. And when we're talking about the herd type of society, which he says Christianity or any society that wants to look after the trodden masses, when you're talking about their kind of morality, you'll pretty much find that they're trying to protect themselves from certain fears. Morality of other types of societies or different people in different classes is very different. All right, so take a note. All right, so when this society starts to balance itself, you'll find that we start to value differently tribes or traits that actually had different meanings in the past. And this is what he means. I mean, he would have thought that in a society like ancient Rome or a society which was a bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? A society that wasn't so feudal, wasn't so Christian from his particular point of view. You know, the act of pity was meaningless. You could do it, but that was just a preference of something you're doing. People wouldn't judge you harshly or negatively for not showing pity or for showing pity, right? It was just a meaningless act showing pity to other people. And of course, pity translates into compassion, sorry. But in a Christian society, this particular value or this drive, this behavior, this virtue, it tends to be celebrated. It's almost like it's a quality that belongs to the supermen of society, people who can show compassion and pity. And then he starts to say that, well, in previous societies that weren't Christian, that gave into a different type of ethic or a different type of way of thinking about the world, um, some qualities that were pretty useful then seem to be quite useless now, and they're almost immoral. Like, consider revenge. People would consider revenge at this point in time quite petty. But if you think about a society where you had virtuous warriors, revenge would have been considered a way to preserve your honor. It's something that you would have done to maintain your honor and to being seen as quite useful and quite okay. Yeah. So take a note. But of course, in a society full of the herd, and the way that he defines the herd, he doesn't really do that enough here, I think. But I'll just tell you the way he defines the herd. The herd is the mass of people, the large group of people who have always been slaves and all of a sudden have found themselves in a unique position to be in control of society. So basically, the herd is like a collection of people that have evolved out of or have grown out of a situation where they used to be the oppressed. And now they find themselves in the dominant position of society. And he would say pretty much Christianity or any other secular movement that tries to celebrate the virtues of Christianity or celebrate the values of Christianity. These are kind of herd-based societies, okay? And he very much thinks that Europe at his particular time was a herd society where people just blindly follow the herd. So revenge, according to the herd, is immoral because it threatens the balance, right? And that's really, really important. Any quality that threatens the balance or threatens the overall harmony of the herd is considered to be an immoral behavior. And logically, it follows then that if anybody acted contrary to the herd's sanctioned values, that such as rapaciousness, which would have been considered fine if you read the Iliad. It's basically acquiring wealth for wealth's sake and lots of it. Yeah, what he's basically saying here is that if you act in a way that's contrary to it, the society in question starts to look at your behavior and its confidence in itself breaks down into pieces and it feels really, really threatened by your behavior. Because it feels so threatened by your behavior, it's something it's really afraid of because it shatters its own confidence. Instead of saying it is bad, your behavior is called evil. And he believes there is a major difference between evil and bad. Evil is like a slave morality word. It's a word that belongs to people who are of the herd. And the herd acquires a slave morality because it grew out of being an oppressed bunch of people. And he basically says that evil means something very different to bad, which would have been a word that would have been used by aristocrats or a master class. Whereas this bad, it didn't have the same kind of absolute dire consequences behind it. So take a note. All right. So, once this society and the herd society starts feeling protected, it starts to completely reject any dangerous or stern values, anything that can really threaten itself. And this is what he thinks is actually a big issue. It's really a really big problem because basically, whenever anyone um, behaves differently, people feel threatened. And because people then don't want to feel threatened, they don't want to feel fear, they end up being dominated by a morality which is obsessed with being meek and passive. It causes morbid mellowing and it's ridiculously overly compassionate. It's overly tender. This is why I got you to draw the picture of the homeless man because I just feel sorry for him. I don't like people being homeless. I want to help them and protect them. But this kind of concern for people, being overly concerned for them and worrying about them is pretty much indicative of a herd morality, he would argue. Yeah. It makes us weak. It makes us passive. And it makes us weak to the point where, because we're always mellow and we're always overly tender and kind, we can't stand up for ourselves. Take a note. So Nietzsche says this kind of mentality, this weakness is really bad because it means we're not going to stand up for our own lives and our own morality. We're going to let the wicked get away with being wicked because to punish them is, again, it's not something which is passive or mellow or kind. So we don't do it. But ironically, even though he says that we don't punish those for doing harm, he goes on to say that this notion of progress is a very herd mentality concept. Ironically, we try and create societies that annihilate fear because our morality and our collective unconsciousness is dominated by fear. So we try and annihilate all our fears and create a completely safe and secure society. Okay, which means that we probably would prevent or do whatever we could to get rid of the terrorists or the people that did harm us, which is a bit ironic considering we say we would let people harm us because we've been made passive and meek and mild. Obviously, progress is the annihilation of fear, which means we are trying to get rid of people who would seek to do us harm, which is a contradiction. Um, but the thing is that because progress unfolds over time, that goes on and on and on, there will be a point where this kind of slave morality makes redundant the morality that's designed to protect it, because it's going to design and create a society that's annihilated all of its fears. And once that society is completely safe, the morality that had protected it becomes redundant because you no longer have anything to fear. And his overall conclusion is that fear is necessary for this kind of herd morality. So take a note. Another thing you should have got was basically that there will be a time when this kind of morality is just obsolete. It doesn't work anymore. And we have to move on to a new morality. So let's start reading this section, shall we? So long as the utility or use which dominates moral value judgments is solely that which is useful to the herd. I tried to define what the herd was before. Remember, a class of society that found itself dominant and probably the majority of people that came from a history of being the oppressed. Okay? So long as the utility which dominates the value judgments is solely that which is useful to the herd, so long as the object is solely the preservation of the community and the immoral is sought precisely and exclusively in that which seems to imperil or threaten the existence of the community, so long as that is the case, there can be no morality of love of one's neighbour. You're saying, wow, this is a contradiction. We don't love your neighbour. You probably fear your neighbour, and then you turn that into love, but the love is of a meekness. So maybe we should actually write that down. There can be no morality of love one's neighbour. Can you write that down? Hopefully you also wrote down why he wrote it down. You could see the contradiction in it. If morality is based on fear, does one really love thy neighbour or fear thy neighbour? Supposing that even Supposing that even there are a constant little exercise of consideration, pity, fairness, mildness, mutual aid was practiced, supposing that even at that stage of society, all those drives are active which are later honourably designated virtues. So I'm saying we practice all these things here and then they're called virtues because we like them and are finally practically equated with the concept of morality. So he's saying, suppose we take all these herd values and we turn them into virtues and then we turn that into morality. In that era, they do not yet by any means belong to the domain of moral valuations. They are still extra moral. So what he's saying here is, I don't know which era he's referring to. Supposing that even there are constant little exercise of consideration, pity, fairness, mildness, mutual aid, it was practiced. Supposing that even at that stage of society, all those drives are active, which are later honourably designated, as virtues and are finally practically equated with the concept of morality. In that era, they do not yet, by any means, belong to the domain of moral valuations. They are still extra moral. So what he's saying is that there are qualities, and this is where it might be a bit confusing, but there are qualities which may have started off as like little kind of virtues, little nice things to do, little things to do, but they didn't have that kind of extra significance of being moral, right? And then they might have evolved into virtues and then evolved into morality. But in the first state, things like fairness, mildness, pity, those kind of things would have just been considered niceties. They wouldn't have had the same kind of huge moral designation. And this is very clear to Nietzsche's work. He really does try and look at the definitions of different words and then try and tease the subtle differences to them. And he's quite honestly saying, you know, these start off as kind of little exercises of consideration, little things that we do, and then they turn into virtues, and then they turn into morality. Okay, but each time they turn into these different things, they're acquiring a different level of meaning and a different level of significance. So maybe you need to write that down because it's very much a Nietzschean method. Okay, write that down. All right. And in that era, they do not by any means belong to the domain of valuations. They are still extra moral. And here he tries to give us an example of how pity may have started off as like something nice to do, didn't really mean that much, then it evolved into a complete act of morality, right? Or an act of pity, for example, was during the finest age of Rome considered neither good nor bad, neither moral nor immoral. And even if it was commended, this commendation was entirely compatible with a kind of involuntary disdain. Oh, that's nice. That's what he's basically saying. An aristocrat would have thought, isn't that nice? Well, he did something. He had an act of pity. Move on. Not much of a consideration. As soon, that is, as it was set beside any action which served the welfare of the whole of the res publica. So, in other words, people would have said, oh, it's nice. Did it for the republic. Did it for everyone. Ultimately, love thy neighbor is always, something secondary, in part conventional and arbitrarily, which means meaningless, illusion when compared with fear one's neighbor. When the structure of society seems to have been in general fixed and made safe from external dangers, it is this fear of one's neighbor which again creates a new perspectives or a new moral valuation. So what he's saying is when you move from living in a Roman society which didn't have this paranoid fear or fear of the neighbor, the act of pity was different. It had a different quality. But when you had really not what was love thy neighbor, what he believes was probably one of the true tenets of Christianity, which was fear thy neighbor, except it's unconsciously meant, or you have to read it psychoanalytically to get it. Obviously, the act of pity takes on a new significance. Okay, take a note. So, which again, new perspectives of moral valuation. There are certain strong and dangerous drives such as enterprisingness, foolhardiness, revengefulness, craft, rapacity. Rapacity means to just take stuff, ambition, and which hitherto had not only to be honoured from the point of view of their social utility, like these were useful drives in ancient Rome, under different names naturally from those chosen here. So he's basically saying that you didn't call rapacity. You would have called it what's a positive spin on just taking things that you want. You called it like you're being an entrepreneur. You were acquiring wealth, generating wealth, and taking for the good of Rome. Those kind of things. You know, um, but also, so as you're saying, obviously they had positive qualities, but given different words or different meanings to give them a positive spin. But also mightily developed and cultivated. So these were values under different names with a positive spin that were mightily cultivated by a society of a master class such as that in Rome. Take a note. And then he goes on to explain why. Because they were constantly needed to protect the community as a whole against the enemies of the community as a whole. So that's what would have been needed in ancient Rome to protect the community. These drives are now felt to be doubly dangerous. So then they're more dangerous than they should be, is what he's saying. And that's the drive of everything mentioned up here. And are gradually branded as immoral and given over to calumny, the antithetical, which means opposite. The antithetical drives of things he says up here: rapacity, ambition, enterprisingness, foolhardy, revengefulness, craft. All right. The antithesis, the opposites of them. Right. The antithetical drives and inclinations, so tendencies to behave a certain way, now come into moral honor. So now we celebrate their opposites. Okay. Step by step, the herd instinct draws its conclusions. How much or how little that is dangerous to the community, dangerous to equality, resides in an opinion, in a condition or emotion, in a will, in a talent, that is now the moral perspective. Here again, fear is the mother of morality. So what he's basically saying is these antithetical drives and inclinations to what Rome would have celebrated are now viewed as dangerous to the community. How much or how little that is dangerous to the community, dangerous to equality, resides in an opinion, in a condition or an emotion, in a will or in a talent that is now the moral perspective. Here again, fear is the mother of morality. So I think I'm going to understand what he means by that last sentence later, but he's basically saying fear is what makes morality in a society that's moved on from those ancient Roman values. So a herd morality based society. Take a note. So I think what he's alluding to now is basically if I have step by step herd instincts draws its conclusion, how much or how little that is dangerous to the community, how much or how little that is dangerous to the community, how much or how little that is dangerous to the community, dangerous to equality, resides in an opinion. All right, so how much or how little, so basically he's saying, I have to be really clear here, how much or how little that is dangerous to society or to the community, is dangerous to equality, resides in an opinion that people have, in a condition or an emotion, in a will, in a talent, that is now the moral perspective. So he's saying the moral perspective has changed according to the opinion of the time, according to the talents of the time, according to the emotions of the time, okay? And here he tries to talk about how this can be quite dangerous because fear is the mother of morality. When the highest and strongest drives breaking passionately out carry the individual far above and beyond the average and lowlands of the herd conscience, the self-confidence of the community goes to pieces. Its faith in itself, its spine, as it were, is broken. So we're saying when someone stands out in a crowd because they are breaking free because of their own internal passions, that threatens the herd community, which is what I said above in the summary. I think you need to take another note. All right. Consequently, it is precisely these drives which are most branded and calumniated, or, not liked. Lofty spiritual independence, the will to stand alone, great intelligence even, are felt to be dangerous. So he's saying in this herd mentality, being independent, being by yourself, being even smart or proud, they're considered to be dangerous qualities. Everything that raises the individual above the herd and makes his neighbour quail, which means really afraid, is henceforth called evil. And here we go to why he says the real aspect of Christianity is fear thy neighbour, not love thy neighbour. The fair, modest, obedient, self-effacing disposition. So being fair, being modest, being obedient, you know, putting yourself down, the mean and the average in desires, acquires moral names and honours. So what he's saying is that the morale of the new moral terms are based on these meek, passive virtues of being modest, obedient, self-effacing. And of course, they change their name. They have positive spin on them. But basically, that's what they are. Eventually, under every peaceful condition, there is less and less an occasional need to educate one's feelings in severity and sternness. In other words, don't have the severe, stern, strong feelings anymore. And now every kind of severity, even severity in justice begins to trouble the conscience, and stern and lofty nobility and self-responsibility is received almost as an offence and awakens mistrust. The lamb, even more the sheep, is held in higher and higher respect. All right. So what he's basically saying here is that because there is a drive in the herd to celebrate different virtues, ones that don't threaten or upset the stability of the herd, we start celebrating meekness and become passive as a result. And there comes a point of morbid mellowing and over-tenderness in the history, and that's why we're referring to the homeless man. Being overly kind, overly nice, overly over to people who might not deserve it, and I'm saying homeless people do deserve it, but being obsessed with being kind and charity, etc., is an issue for him. In the history of society at which it takes the side of even him who harms it, the criminal. So we're saying we're being even too nice to the criminal and who honestly and wholeheartedly, and does so honestly and wholeheartedly. So we let people who harm us get away with it because we still have to be meek and passive. Punishment, that seems to it somehow unfair. Certainly the idea of being punished and having to punish is unpleasant to it, makes it afraid. It is not enough to render him harmless. Why punish him as well? To administer punishment is itself dreadful. With this question, herd morality, the morality of timidity, draws its ultimate conclusion. Supposing all danger, the cause of fear, could be abolished, this morality would therewith also be abolished. So if people had no longer things to fear, they wouldn't be so meek and passive because there'd be no need for it. They don't need to protect themselves from threats or fears. And those values no longer need to be celebrated, or the values that could make you a threat no longer need to. Sorry, the values that make you a threat no longer need to be feared because there's no worry anymore. It would no longer be necessary. It would no longer regard itself as necessary. He who examines the conscience of the present day European will have an extract from 1,000 moral recesses and hiding places. Always the same imperative, the imperative of herd timidity. We wish that there will one day no longer be anything to fear. One day, everything in Europe, the will and the way to that day now is called progress. So here he's basically saying progress is the progression towards us living in a society where one day there will be no longer anything to fear, which is the result of the herd timidity trying to drive us away from fear and annihilate it. That's all it's saying. So, what have we got here? Did we name, define, and interrelate key terms? Did we explore the drives and behaviours that were valued by different kinds of societies? Well, obviously, ancient Rome would use a positive spin on all the values that he mentioned because they served the interest of Rome. Whereas, of course, Christian Europe had a positive spin on other values because it served the interest of the herd class or um, the herd-based society because it's afraid. Um, and then we talked about how progress is the annihilation of that fear, that tendency for society to annihilate that fear. And he says ultimately, one day, that is going to create a situation where we no longer need that type of morality. We'll explore why Nietzsche held morality, yeah, it says herd morality celebrates, drives, and behaviors and values that enable the herd to protect itself. Obviously, all type of morality protects the dominant class at the time, the dominant interests of the group. And in Christian Europe, he says that it's the herd class that obviously asserted it. But you can see how he's afraid that that inability to accept difference is what drives man back to averageness and stops great things from happening. And he thought that was quite negative. So if you get all that, you kind of understand that chapter, that section, and everything is going swimmingly well. Score yourself again on these success criteria. And I think you kind of know why I don't really agree with Nietzsche, because I still think this is a recipe for alienation from fellow man where the individual grows. I'm going to say that. I think that's one flaw in Nietzsche's philosophy. It's an inability to accept that through others, one grows as an individual. He's kind of got this romantic version of a completely self-independent person. All right, cheers.